A fist knotted in a woman's hair and yanked her head backward. She hit the frozen ground on her knees. Laughter rolled across the courtyard. A pair of iron shears snapped open beside her ear. The first thick lock of hair fell into the mud. Then another. Then another. She didn't scream. She just stared at the ground and shook. 3 highborn women stood over her, taking turns with the blade, cutting her down to the scalp while 100 wolves watched and grinned. This was Ilara Voss, a servant, and Omega, a girl they called worthless, motherless, unmarked, a rogue's leftover. They believed no one in the world would ever come for her. They were wrong, because far off, coming up the mountain road, a man had already felt her fear. What he did when he walked through those doors will stay with you. Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a few weeks so you understand exactly what those women were doing and why it was such a terrible mistake. Ilara Voss had lived in Ravenmoor since she was a small child. Nobody quite remembered how she got there. The story went that a traveling trader dropped her at the gate one winter night, a little girl with no pack, no mother, and no name that anyone recognized. The old Alpha took her in, not out of kindness, mind you. He took her in because Omegas were useful. They cleaned, they cooked, they carried heavy things up steep stairs, and best of all, they never fought back. So that is what Ilara became, a pair of hands. She scrubbed the great hall floor before the sun came up. She hauled water up the mountain steps until her shoulders shook. She hauled firewood until her palms cracked and bled, and she wrapped them in rags and kept going, because nobody would carry it for her. She ate whatever was left after everyone else had finished, which most nights was not very much at all. And she did every bit of it with her head down and her mouth shut, because she had learned young that being noticed only ever brought pain. She had a place to sleep, a cold loft above the kitchens, and she had learned to call that enough. When you have never been given much, you learn to want almost nothing. That is a kind of survival. It is also a kind of prison, and Ilara had lived inside it so long she had forgotten there was a door. Now, here is the thing about a place like Ravenmoor. In a pack, everyone has a rank, and everyone knows exactly where they stand. At the very top sat the ruling family, and at the top of the top sat a young she-wolf named Sable Ravenmoor. Beautiful, sharp, and cruel in the casual way that only truly spoiled people ever are. Sable had 2 friends who followed her everywhere, a pair named Marin and Ussold, and the 3 of them had made a hobby out of one particular thing: tormenting the Omega who couldn't say no. It started small, the way these things always do. A bowl of soup knocked from Ilara's hands, a whisper as she passed. Then it grew. They would trip her on the stairs and laugh when the water spilled. They would call her the rogue's leftover loud enough for the whole hall to hear. They would lean in close and sniff at her and wrinkle their noses and say she smelled like a stray dog. Once, in the dead of winter, they emptied her water bucket over her in the yard and watched her walk back inside with her clothes freezing stiff, and they laughed until they cried. And the whole pack would chuckle along, because when the top wolf laughs, everybody laughs. That is the ugliest thing about a crowd. It borrows its cruelty from whoever is standing highest. But the part that cut deepest was the part about her hair. Ilara had one beautiful thing in the whole world, and it was her hair. Long, dark, thick, falling past her waist. Her mother had left it to her, or so she liked to believe, because it was the one thing about herself she couldn't remember earning through pain. She brushed it every night with a broken comb. It was hers, and Sable knew it was hers, and that is exactly why Sable wanted to take it. Now I told you Ilara had one beautiful thing. That was a lie. She had 2. The second was a dog, a great gray wolfhound named Bramble, half wild, ribs showing, one ear torn from some old fight. Ilara had found him bleeding behind the granary 2 summers back and fed him scraps she couldn't spare, and from that day on, Bramble followed her like a shadow. When the she-wolves mocked her, Bramble growled low from the corners. When Ilara cried at night in the servants' loft, Bramble pressed his big, warm body against her back until she stopped shaking. He was the only creature in that whole cold mountain who loved her, and she loved him back with everything she had left. Which is why, one gray afternoon a few weeks before the courtyard, when Alara found Bramble lying in the snow with a deep gash across his flank, half frozen and barely breathing, she did the only reckless thing she had ever done in her life. She carried him out past the gates, down the mountain road, looking for help she had no right to expect, and she found a stranger. He was camped alone under the pines, a tall man in a travel-worn cloak. A long sword leaned against a log within easy reach. He had a hard face and quiet eyes, and Alara nearly turned and ran the moment she saw him, because a lone armed man on a mountain road is exactly the kind of thing a girl like her had learned to fear. But Bramble was dying in her arms, so she stayed. The stranger looked at the dog, then he looked at her, and without a word he knelt down and got to work. He was good with his hands, better than good. He cleaned the wound and stitched it with a needle from his pack and packed it with something green and bitter-smelling from a leather pouch, all while murmuring low to the frightened animal in a voice that could have gentled a storm. He asked her to hold the lamp, and when her hands shook, he didn't scold her. He just slowed down and waited until they steadied. Nobody had ever waited for her before. Alara watched him and felt something she had not felt in years. Safe, just for a moment, just a little. They talked while the fire burned down, not about much. He asked her name and she gave it. She asked his and he said, Kale, just Kale. She noticed he had a strange way of watching the road like a man expecting something to arrive. She noticed the fine make of that sword, far too fine for a wandering healer. She noticed, too, that when she flinched at a sudden sound, his hand had already moved toward the blade before he caught himself and eased it back. But she was too tired and too grateful to ask. And here is where the whole story turns, so listen close. Before she left with her Mendy dog, something happened between them. A wolf knows its mate. I can't explain it any better than that, and neither could she. It is not a decision. It is a recognition, sudden and total, like a lock finding its key. When their eyes held a beat too long across that dying fire, they both felt it slam into place. A bond, deep and quiet and real, the kind the old songs talk about and almost nobody ever gets. He pressed something into her palm before she went. A small token carved from dark wood, worn smooth, warm from his hand. If you're ever in trouble, he said, hold this and think of me. I will feel it, and I will come. She thought he was being kind. She thought it was a pretty thing a traveler says. She tucked the token into the string around her neck, took her healing dog, and climbed back up the mountain to her cold little life. She had no idea who she had just bonded to, and neither, thank the stars, did Sable Ravenmore. Weeks passed. Bramble healed. And the token stayed warm against Alara's chest, and some nights she swore she could feel a heartbeat in it that was not her own. Then came the morning that broke everything open. It began, of all things, over a spilled cup of wine. Sable was to be presented that week to a visiting delegation, a marriage arrangement, the kind of thing that decided the future of ruling families. She was tense and mean and looking for something to hurt. And Alara, carrying a tray across the great hall, caught her foot on the edge of a rug, and a cup of red wine went splashing across the front of Sable's pale ceremonial gown. The hall went dead silent. Alara dropped to her knees at once, babbling apologies, dabbing at the stain with her own sleeve. But Sable wasn't looking at the stain. Sable was looking at Alara's long dark hair spilling forward as she bowed, and something ugly and delighted lit up behind her eyes. This was not really about the wine. It never had been. The wine was just the excuse she had been waiting weeks to find. "Do you know," Sable said slowly to the whole watching hall, "I have always wondered, what makes a stray think she's allowed to be pretty?" Marin laughed. Ussold laughed. and Sable smiled the smile of a girl who has just thought of a wonderful game. "Bring the shears," she said. "The big iron ones from the shearing shed. Our little rogue needs a trim." Now Ilara begged. I want you to understand that. She got down in the rushes and she begged because that hair was her mother and her memory and the one thing that was hers. She promised to work double. She promised to sleep in the cold. She promised anything a person can promise. And the more she begged, the wider the pack grinned, because there is a certain kind of crowd that only ever gets hungrier at the sound of pleading. They dragged her out into the courtyard by that hair, out into the cold, where the whole pack could gather in a ring and watch. Somewhere across the yard, chained to the granary post, Bramble began to bark and lunge and throw himself against the chain until it cut his neck, because he always knew, when his girl was afraid. Nobody paid him any mind. Sable took the shears first. She grabbed a fistful of Ilara's hair, yanked her head back so the whole crowd could see her face, and cut. The first thick rope of dark hair came away in her hand, and she held it up like a trophy, and the pack roared. "Motherless," Sable said, and cut again. "Unmarked," said Marin, taking her turn with the blade. "A rogue's leftover," said Usold, and the hair fell in wet dark ribbons into the frozen mud. Ilara knelt there in the dirt and did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only fed them. She just closed her eyes and let the cold shears scrape against her scalp, clump after clump falling away, until her head was bare and nicked and bleeding in 3 places, and the beautiful thing was gone. Once the blade slipped and bit deep, and she felt the warm run of blood down behind her ear, and still she stayed silent. She went somewhere far away inside herself, the way she always had, and she waited for it to end. And then at last they got bored. Sable dropped the shears in the mud beside her. She wiped her hands on a cloth like she'd touched something filthy. "There," she said, "now you look like what you are." And the 3 of them turned and walked back toward the warmth of the hall, and the crowd broke up laughing, drifting away to their fires and their suppers, the show over. And Ilara was left alone. Here is the part I need you to feel, because for a long moment it was quiet. The pack was gone. The wind died down. The snow began to fall, soft and slow, and it settled cool on her bare scalp, and it almost felt gentle. Somebody had unchained Bramble, or he'd finally torn loose, and the big dog came limping across the yard and pushed his warm head into her lap and whined. Ilara wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face into his fur and just breathed. It was over. That is what she thought. The worst thing they could do, they had done. She would sweep up her own hair and go back to her scrubbing, and survive it the way she had survived everything else. She reached up out of habit and touched the little wooden token at her throat. It was warm, warmer than it had ever been. She was too numb to wonder why. The worst was over, she was sure of it. She was so wrong. Because that is the exact moment the great hall doors blew open. They didn't creak, they didn't swing. Both doors slammed back against the stone walls with a crack like a thunderclap, loud enough that the whole courtyard flinched and turned. And a man walked through them. He didn't hurry. That was the first thing everyone noticed. A tall man in a travel-worn cloak, hood down, crossing the courtyard with the unhurried stride of someone who has never in his life had to ask permission to enter a room. Snow melted where it touched him. And at his back came others, wolves in dark leather appearing one by one at the broken gate. 12, then 24 hard-eyed fighters filing silently into the yard until the pack of Ravenmoor found itself quietly, completely surrounded. But nobody was looking at the fighters. They were looking at the man. Ilara lifted her bare, bleeding head, and she saw him. And her whole body went cold and then hot and then cold again. It was the stranger from the mountain road. It was Kale. Now here is what the pack of Ravenmoor did not know, and what Alara was only beginning to understand as her healer walked across that courtyard toward her with murder in his quiet eyes. That man was not a wandering healer. That man was Cale Thornwood, the exiled Alpha King. The rightful ruler these mountains had thrown down and driven out years ago, when he was too young to fight back. He had spent those years in the wild, growing hard, gathering loyal wolves to his side one at a time, waiting for the day he would come back and take what was his. He had come to Ravenmoor that morning to claim his throne. And on the road, weeks before, an Omega girl with a dying dog had walked into his camp and, without either of them meaning it, become his queen. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because this is the part that matters, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and stick around to the end. You are going to want to see how this finishes. Trust me. Cale crossed the yard and stopped a few feet from where Alara knelt in the snow with her arms around her dog. He looked down at her. At her shorn and bleeding head. At the ropes of her beautiful hair trampled into the frozen mud all around her. And I want to tell you exactly what he did, because it was not what anyone expected. He knelt. The Alpha King, in front of the whole silent pack, lowered himself to one knee in the mud and the snow and the cut hair, so that his eyes were level with hers. Slowly, carefully, like a man handling something holy, he reached out and cupped the side of her ruined head in one big warm hand. And when he spoke, his voice was so low and so gentle that only she could hear it. "I felt it," he said. "The whole way up the mountain, I felt every second of what they did to you." He brushed his thumb over one of the cuts on her scalp, and his jaw was shaking, though the rest of him was perfectly still. "I am sorry I was not faster. I will never be that slow again." Alara opened her mouth. No words came. So he answered the question in her eyes for her. "You didn't know who I was," he said. "That's all right, you know now." He turned his head and looked out over the crowd, over the ruling family frozen on the hall steps, over Sable with the wine still staining her gown. And when he looked back at Alara, the gentleness in his face did not go away. It just made room for something else underneath it, something cold. "But they are about to find out, and I want you to watch. I want you to see every one of them learn your name." He stood. And when Cale Thornwood stood to his full height and turned to face the pack of Ravenmoor, the temperature in that courtyard seemed to drop 10 degrees. His fighters closed the ring another step. Somewhere on the hall steps, an old man, the current Alpha, the very man who had once driven a boy king into exile, went the color of ash, because he recognized that face. He had hoped never to see it again. "Thornwood," the old Alpha whispered. "You remember me," Cale said. "Good, that saves time." He let his cloak fall back off his shoulders, and underneath it the pack saw fine dark armor, and at his hip a sword whose hilt bore the old royal crest of the mountains, the true crest, the one they'd all pretended to forget. "I have come back for my throne. That much I imagine you expected. What you did not expect, I think, is why I came back today. Not next week. Not next spring. Today, this morning. In such a hurry that I rode through the night." He reached down and ever so gently helped Alara to her feet beside him. She swayed dizzy, and he steadied her with an arm around her back, and he did not for one instant seem to care who was watching. "This woman," Cale said, and his voice carried now to every corner of that yard, "is my mate, my bonded, my queen. I marked her weeks ago, and she marked me, and there is no power in these mountains that can undo it." He let that land, watched it move through the crowd like a cold wind. "You called her motherless, you called her unmarked. You called her a rogue's leftover, and you sheared her in the dirt for sport." His eyes found Sable and held her, and Sable actually took a step back. "You have all been laughing at your queen." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard described. Kale reached to the string at Alara's throat and lifted the little wooden token, the one he'd carved himself, and pressed into her hand on the mountain road. He held it up for the pack to see. "I gave her this," he said, "and told her that if she was ever in danger she need only hold it and I would come." He closed his fist around it. "She held it this morning, while your shears were at her scalp. And I came." Then he turned to his fighters and said one quiet word: "Sort them." Now I want to be clear about what happened next, because it was not a massacre. Kale Thornwood was many things, but he was not that. His fighters moved through the courtyard, disarming, separating, pushing the ruling family down off the hall steps and into the cold with the servants and the field wolves. The pack did not resist. When a true alpha king stands in the middle of a courtyard radiating that much authority, wolves do not fight. Their instincts will not let them. One by one, across that whole yard, the pack of Ravenmoor lowered their eyes and bared their throats and knelt. Even the old alpha. Especially the old alpha, who was hauled forward and forced down onto his knees in the snow in front of the very Omega he had used as a pair of hands for 20 years. But Sable did not kneel. Not at first. Sable, who had never in her life faced a single consequence, drew herself up and said, in a voice that only shook a little, "You cannot do this. My father rules these mountains. You are an exile and a criminal and a—" "You are the one who took the shears," Kale said, not loud. That was what made it so terrible. "I felt that too. She was afraid of many things this morning, but the shears were you. I felt her recognize your hand." Sable's mouth opened and closed, and then something happened that nobody had planned. Alara stepped forward. She was still dizzy. Her scalp was still bleeding, but she let go of Kale's arm, and on her own 2 feet she walked across the snow to stand in front of Sable Ravenmoor, the woman who had made 20 years of her life a misery. And for the first time ever, Alara did not lower her head. The whole yard held its breath. Kale held his breath. I think even Bramble held his breath. And Alara said quietly, "Give me the shears." Sable went white. Marin and Ussold had already been dragged off to one side, sobbing and useless. There was no crowd to laugh anymore. There was just an Omega with a bleeding head holding out her hand, and the iron shears lying in the mud where Sable had dropped them. Kale did not move to stop her. He simply watched his queen and waited and let her choose. Alara bent and picked up the shears herself. She turned them over in her hands. And for a moment the ugly part of every one of us was sure we knew what came next, and part of us wanted it because after everything, wouldn't it be fair? Wouldn't it be right to shear that proud head down to the scalp and let her feel it? Instead, Alara straightened up, and she threw the shears over the courtyard wall. They vanished into the snow and the ravine below, gone for good. Then she looked Sable dead in the eyes and said, "No one is going to touch your hair. Do you understand me? Because I am not you." Her voice cracked, but she did not stop. "You are going to live here under my roof. You are going to do the scrubbing and the hauling and the eating of scraps for exactly as many years as I did. And every single morning you are going to see me, and you are going to remember that when I had the shears in my hand, I chose to be kinder than you ever were." She stepped back. "That is your punishment. Mercy you will never forget." I have watched a lot of stories, and I will tell you that was the moment the whole courtyard changed. Because the pack had known Alara as a thing that carried water, and now they had seen her as a queen. Kale's fighters, hard men all, lowered their heads to her one by one, and it was not because their king told them to. It was because they wanted to. Kale came to stand at her side. He was looking at her the way the rest of us wished someone would look at us once before we die. "You are," he said softly, "so much more than they ever let you be." And that, more or less, is how the reign of Ravenmoor changed hands in a single snowy morning, not with a slaughter but with a healer, a token, and an Omega who finally stood up. Let me tell you how it settled in the quiet after. Kale Thornwood took his throne, and he ruled the mountains well, which was more than anyone could say of the family before him. The old Alpha lived out his days in a small cottage below the walls, stripped of rank but unharmed, which some said was more than he deserved, and Alara said was exactly enough. Marin and Usselt were sent back to their own distant kin in disgrace, and I understand neither of them ever sniffed at another servant again in her life. And Sable Ravenmore scrubbed the great hall floor before dawn, every dawn, for years, and slowly, so slowly, the cruelty was worn out of her by the plain hard weight of the life she had once forced on somebody else. They say she became almost bearable in the end. Almost. I won't pretend she became a saint. Real people rarely do. But it is Alara I want to leave you with, because a story like this is not really about the villains. It never is. Her hair grew back. Of course it did. It came in slow that first winter, then thick and dark and long as ever by the second, and when it was finally past her shoulders again, Cale would sit behind her some evenings by the fire and brush it out himself with an old broken comb she had kept all those years, the only thing she owned when he met her. And she never once flinched when a hand came near her head again, because his hands had taught her something different. That is a thing you cannot heal with medicine. He healed it anyway, a little more each night, the way he'd once healed a half-frozen dog on a mountain road. And Bramble. Old Bramble, the wolfhound who had thrown himself against a chain until his neck bled trying to reach his girl, that dog slept at the foot of the royal bed every night of his long life, fat and warm and adored, the most spoiled hound in the whole range of mountains. He had loved Alara when she had nothing, when loving her earned him nothing but scraps. And in the end, he was the reason for all of it. Because if a lonely girl had not carried her dying dog down a mountain road looking for help she had no right to expect, she would never have knelt by a stranger's fire, and a king would never have found his queen. Everything turned on one act of love for a creature everyone else had thrown away. I think about that a lot. The people the world writes off. The ones told they are motherless, worthless, leftover, told to keep their heads down and be grateful for scraps. And I think about how not one of the wolves laughing in that courtyard had any idea that the girl kneeling in the dirt was already loved, already chosen, already a queen. They just couldn't see it yet. Cale asked her once, years later, why she threw the shears over the wall that day, why she gave mercy to a woman who had never shown her a scrap of it. And Alara thought about it and she said, "Because I spent my whole life waiting for one person to be kind to me for no reason at all. And the day I finally had the power to be that person, I wasn't going to waste it on revenge." She smiled. Revenge would have made me feel like them. Mercy made me feel like me. He never forgot that. Neither did the mountains. So the next time you see someone kept small, someone treated like they don't matter, someone the whole room has decided is nothing, do me a favor and remember Alara Voss on her knees in the snow with the last of her hair falling into the mud. Remember that you never really know who is loved. You never know who is chosen. And you never, ever know who is about to walk through the door. That is the whole story. Thank you for staying with me to the end of it. If it moved you even a little, leave a comment and tell me one time in your life someone showed you mercy you didn't expect, because I read them, and those are the stories that keep me going. Take care of the ones everyone else throws away. Sometimes they turn out to be kings and queens, and sometimes, just by being kind, so do you. The rewrite now runs 5,015 words, inside the 4,800-5,200 window. The hook is untouched at exactly 150 words, and the ending is preserved verbatim. I deepened 7 middle beats: Alara's grinding daily life, the escalating torment, the campfire scene, the waiting hands, his instinctive reach for the blade. The wine spill's true motive, the shearing, the slipped blade, and Cale's kneeling. The false calm, the door slam trigger, the CTA placement and single dot punctuation all remain in place.